What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you end up enjoying this video, doing any of those helps the video to do well and the channel to do well, and ensures I can continue making this content daily for many years to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the video, please be sure to share them in the comments below, as I always read all of them, even if I don't always get the chance to respond to them all. Last but not least, if you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and all that, please be sure to check out the join button somewhere around the subscribe button. If you click on that, it will let you join the channel membership for as low as $2 a month, and you get special access to emoticons you can use when you comment, and special icons that appear next to your name as well. No content will ever be locked behind the paywall, it's just something extra you can do if you'd like to support the channel further. Without further ado though guys, we'll get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. Okay, so years of watching and reading about true crime has led me to be extra cautious and always on the lookout for people who are out of place or acting odd. I believe this has helped me from several bad encounters, and this is probably the worst of them. I was a junior in college at a local university that was located in the city. The campus was about a mile wide, and I lived just over a mile away from it. I lived in an apartment building that was owned by the university, so only students lived there. It was known as the poor kids' apartments and was the farthest from campus. It was also in a fairly bad part of town. The apartments had recently had issues with break-ins, so I was extra cautious about who I held the door open for. The door to the elevators was one that locked when it closed, and only people who lived there had the keys. Sometimes, though, people held the door to save you needing to grab your key. It was about 6 p.m. one night, and I was just returning home from class. I had planned on just stopping at my apartment and then leaving to drive to my mom's house for the weekend. I worked about 40 minutes away near my mom's home, so I tended to stay there on weekends anyway. As I was approaching the elevator door, I noticed that someone was holding it open for a group of us. As I was walking towards it, I noticed one of the people he'd held it open for did not appear to be a college student. Not only was he much older, in his early 40s or so, but he looked homeless for lack of better words. He was extremely dirty and was wearing dirty clothes as well. Obviously, he stood out to me, but apparently not to the other people in the elevator because no one was really watching him except for me. I watched to see what floor he would push when he walked in, but he didn't push a floor button at all. Big red flag right away. I was on the very top floor, and I was one of the last people to enter. I noticed I was the only one to push that floor button. If this guy didn't get out on the lower floor, he was definitely up to something. As the floors started to open and people started to get out, I noticed he was now looking right at me, not getting off at any of the other stops. Before long, it was just me and him. I had to think fast because the fact he didn't press my floor but had entered before me, and the fact that he appeared out of place, were both huge red flags. I decided I would let him out of the elevator first. Then he would have the choice of left or right. If he chose left, I could run right and get to my door. I got my key ready and let him out. He hesitated for a moment, and I pretended to be stuck looking for something in my purse. He got out and went left. Awesome. I head right and sprint right into my apartment, which was located fairly close to the elevator. I glance back just as I'm walking in and see him standing in front of a random door, looking at me. I went into my room and locked the door right away. I grabbed the few things I needed and kept thinking about how weird that was. I almost started to let myself think that maybe he was dating someone in one of the other apartments. I started to try and rationalize his behavior, but I knew this was just strange. I grabbed my things and headed back out. I made sure to double-check the hallway before going to the elevator as well. It was empty. Thank God. I get back in the elevator and take it down to the lobby. I go to get out, when who do I see getting in with a brand new group of people? That same guy. What the f***? Now I knew for sure he was not supposed to be here. He saw me, and his eyes grew wide immediately. I went to pull out my phone because I knew I couldn't just let him wander around here. I was about to call the cops while walking out of the lobby when I ran into the security guard who watches our building after a certain time. I told him everything I'd seen. He decided to contact the police and have them waiting for the man when he got back down. He said he would go up and try to find him as well. He told me I did the right thing. I still felt bad that someone else could have potentially been in danger. I hoped he was only a thief and not some sort of rapist or murderer. I didn't hear anything else about it after, and never ran into that same security guard again, so I can't say what happened for sure. I'd luckily caught a good look at him, so I hope my description helped find him at least. He might have known I was going to do something though, and aborted his mission before he got caught. Either way, I always tell people to watch out for stuff like that. Stuff that we always call red flags around here. So, heads up for right now. This story is actually supremely fucked up. The story is that I went on a website kind of like Facebook, but it wasn't exactly. I guess I'll call it tea time. It was around 2010, and I went on there basically religiously every day. I was quite young and also somewhat dumb. A 14-year-old female. It sounds like a cheesy as hell start, but it was actually quite terrible. As this cheesiness goes, I found a couple of friends on there. Around 5 who I became close with. We didn't instantly become friends though. Gradually grew closer over time. They knew what country and state I lived in, but that was basically it. I was really scared of being stalked by people online. I knew basically just as much about them, because we were friends online, but that was about all. After a year though, I got more close with one of the guys specifically. Things got more intimate, I guess I'd say. He lived all the way on the other side of the country. He'd been planning to meet me for a while, but I didn't quite trust him yet, you know? We were all supposedly around the same age, and had similar interests as well. I just happened to connect with this particular guy the most of all. Eventually, I stopped using tea time. I had school, and I realized something was kind of weird after one of them accidentally called me by my real name. I told them my name was some pseudonym or something. That made me so scared, I deleted that account right away and never logged back on. Then I completely forgot all about that messaging app. Well, what I hadn't seen in the meantime was all of the threatening messages sent to me over and over, telling me to get back on tea time or else. That person didn't seem to care about me at all. He told me my address, my full legal name, where I went to school. He then told me that he and the other guys had intentions of kidnapping me for their boss, some guy named Carlos or something. A very racist Mexican stereotype they'd crafted. I was so scared. I started skipping school, putting up cameras all over the place, wearing different clothes and even changing my hair. November 2012, they finally showed up at my house one day out of nowhere, a day I'd skipped school. They'd brought pistols with them, it seemed, and what looked to be a machete type of knife. I did what I thought was best at the time. I hid in the closet in my room and called the police right away. The faces they made while searching my house for me will haunt me to this day. They made me feel super insecure about myself while insulting me, and told me all the crazy and sadistic things they would do to me if they found me, cutting my skin open, breaking all of my fingers, shoving the knife up my ass. I was mortified. I was so scared in that moment, I forced the lock on my closet so it would stay locked from the inside. When the police arrived, it took them 5 minutes to break me out. I was crying my eyes out, and I was more scared than I'd ever been. Somehow, the police weren't able to catch those guys. I never found my closure. I did find some further information on them though because of others who seemed to have similar problems. It turned out that each of these guys was apparently 40 years old. There was a guy that picked people who looked particularly young to pretend to be young girls and boys and try to befriend kids online. To this day, I still haven't told anyone really. Many times after, I'd skip school out of paranoia and try to play it off as just being sick. I did my best to change everything about me so they wouldn't recognize me again. I have extreme trust issues now. I feel like sharing this did help me get it a bit off my chest. Before then, I'd only told the police and other people involved in the investigation what happened to me. When people say to be careful on the internet, please be sure to keep that in mind. This story is a different kind of scary, but it is still pretty spooky. This happened back when I was in college, when on a complete whim I hopped on the bus and went down to Daytona Beach for spring break. Well, it wasn't a complete whim, I guess. My friend Joey already happened to be down there, and he'd really been bugging me to come down and join him. Joey really didn't work or go to school, but his parents did have a lot of money. Rather than going down to Daytona for spring break for a week, he was there throughout the entire season. He eventually did convince me to come down, when he promised he would bring me back after the week was over. I only had enough money to make the trip one way, if I was going to spend any money there at all. One thing that Joey had left out about our spring break trip is that he had driven his father's motorcycle to get down there. If I wanted to ride back home, it would have to be on the back of his bike. I was not completely comfortable with that arrangement. I did eventually accept it though, because if I spent the rest of my money for a ticket home, I wouldn't be able to have any money for spring break itself. I had a good 5 days or so down there. Then, in order to get back to school on time, Joey would have to take me back home. It would be a 2-day drive, and we would have to get a hotel after the first night. Thankfully, he had his parents' magic credit card and would be paying for everything. We got started relatively early in the day. We went up through Florida and eventually made it into Georgia at around 1 p.m. This is when things started to get a bit ominous. It began to get dark very fast, as the most foreboding storm clouds I had ever seen in my life began to roll in. These weren't just black clouds, these were green clouds, which blocked out the entire sky. It was springtime in Georgia, and by 4 p.m., it was pitch black outside. The only positive was that it hadn't started pouring yet. We wanted to try and make it as far as we could before having to get the hotel room. I had never seen such a sight in my entire life. I really don't think I can do it justice just by describing it. The clouds looked like they were being driven with purpose down on us. I got truly afraid when they started spinning around like funnels right above our heads. I didn't really know if this was indicative of a tornado forming or what, but I could imagine it wasn't a positive thing regardless. Eventually, it began to storm and rain hard. If you've never ridden a motorcycle through a thunderstorm, I can't begin to tell you how scary that is. Each drop of rain slapped us on our faces. My body felt like needles was stabbing into my skin. It hurt real bad. I was worried that the force of the wind and rain would blow our motorcycle off the damn road, but Joey didn't appear to be ready to stop anytime soon. I didn't want to appear like a wuss either, but trust me, I was really scared. We saw a sign for a Holiday Inn at the next exit. It was then that Joey yelled back and asked me if I wanted to take that exit and stop there. I was in severe pain from the storm, and I was cold as well. I was frightened, but I thought about the kind of person Joey was. He was very adventurous, as if you hadn't already figured that out. And for some odd reason, I thought he would have more respect for me if I told him to hold out a bit longer. I yelled back to him, "No, let's see how far we can go before we have to stop." Joey laughed and we continued on. I think we went for another hour or so before Joey decided we were going to have to stop right now. It was just too fierce out there. We found an exit with what I believe was a hotel called Quality Inn or something. We checked in and I decided I needed to take a shower first. Joey was fine with that because he wanted to watch the weather anyways. Joey flipped on the television and of course there was a weather report on right away. I'll never forget in my entire life what it said. The town just off the exit that Joey had asked me if we wanted to stop at was hit just a half hour earlier by that tornado. One of the buildings shown on the news as being completely destroyed, the Holiday Inn we were both going to stay at. We were shocked. If we had taken that exit just an hour ago and checked into that hotel, we would not be here right now. We would have been there right when that tornado destroyed it. It was really weird because I wanted so badly to get out of that storm, but for whatever reason, something told me it was not right to exit at that moment. I always leave my car unlocked. Always. No matter where it is. No matter what I'm doing. No matter how long it'll be. It's always unlocked. The reason for this is because I used to live in a very bad neighborhood. There would always be robberies no matter if you did lock it. Back then, I was a broke-ass college kid though. I didn't have shit for anyone to steal. I also didn't have any money to replace broken windows. I noticed that a lot of people would get their windows smashed in order for people to break into their cars. When I asked around, they told me that the cars with the smashed windows had all been locked, so I left my car unlocked. It's not like I had anything to steal anyway. If they wanted to waste their time rooting around, that's on them. I didn't have any valuables to leave in it, so it's not like I had anything to lose. A few times it had been rummaged through, but I always just cleaned the little mess and moved on with my life. Fast forward to now. I had a closing shift at work about a week ago. I'm a librarian, you see, so I get off at 9 during closing shifts. Not too bad, actually. We all walk out and lock up together. There were 2 parking lots at my library. One in the front where the books were, and one in the back where the labs and computers were. Most of the employees parked in the back, but this particular time I had chosen to park in the front instead. I said goodbye to everyone else and headed out to my car alone. When I finally reached it, I grabbed the handle and pulled. It wouldn't open. For a few moments, I was confused. Then it hit me. My doors were locked now. Instantly, I was unsettled. I got the feeling I was being watched, but I didn't know why. Maybe it was just the weirdness of knowing I hadn't locked the door when I left. I looked around, checked my back seat even, and unlocked it and jumped in. I started and tore out of that parking lot. When I hit the main road home, there was a bit of traffic. It wasn't a lot given the time of night, but it was pretty slow and kept stopping as well. I still had that creeping feeling, but I brushed it off. Surely I had just watched too many horror movies. Then though, as I stopped at a light, I heard a loud screech and a thumping sound. My trunk had just popped open. I waited until I got to a well-lit area to stop. I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station, shaking in my boots. I made sure there were other people around and tiptoed my way over to my trunk. Nothing was in there as I checked, of course, but I did see my things had been moved around to make what looked like a person-sized hiding spot. I might start locking my door from now on. Update. We got feedback on some video surveillance footage at my work. A man who's a bit off that comes into my work a lot got into my car and tinkered around with it for a few minutes. Then he popped my trunk and got in. Apparently he hadn't closed it hard enough to latch it though, so when I stopped it jiggled open. It wasn't just my car either. He'd messed with a couple of other vehicles as well. It seems mine was just the only one that was unlocked. I was recently reminded of an experience I had back in October. I thought my previous experience was my one and only weird backwoods experience, but I guess I was mistaken. Where I live, we have relatively few COVID cases. There were almost none back in the fall. Because of that, although there were certain restrictions still, we had more public health-sanctioned freedoms than many other places. For example, at the time we were permitted to share our social bubble with one other household and travel within our region. My family and our fellow bubble family decided to take advantage of this by going on a fall getaway together. We rented 2 side-by-side cabins in a beautiful waterfront wooded area and had a lovely, relaxing weekend. Although there were other cabins nearby, they were all unoccupied, and we saw no other people there, though we did hear a dog barking a few times somewhere not far off. On our final night there, my son decided to sleep in the other cabin with his bubble buddies. Around 11 p.m. he called me over, asking for some forgotten thing. It was very dark that night, and there were certainly no streetlights in this deeply wooded cabin area. I grabbed my flashlight and began to walk the short distance to the neighboring cabin to deliver whatever it was he'd forgotten. While on my walk back, though, I began to hear a whistling. It was a very human-sounding whistle, the kind someone would make when calling back a dog or something. It sounded very close to me. Shining my light around into the woods, though, I couldn't see anybody there. I heard it once more. I'd assumed it was someone whistling for the dog we'd heard earlier, so I didn't think much of it in that moment. A short time later, another call came from next door. It seemed my son couldn't settle down and wanted to come back over to our cabin. This time, my husband and I walked over together. We collected our child and his things and said goodnight to our bubble family and walked back. We heard the same whistle again now, multiple times. It seemed to be on the dirt road just ahead of us, gradually moving away. My husband commented their dog must have gotten loose or something, and the owner was out looking for it. Inside our cabin, we continued to hear that whistling, coming at irregular intervals, every 2 to 4 minutes or so. At first, it would be quite loud and seem right next to us. Then it would gradually grow fainter, then stop as though they'd move completely out of earshot. Then they would circle around again, coming from the other direction, getting louder as they moved past our cabin, fading once more into the distance. This happened over and over again. Still not thinking that much of it, my husband climbed into the loft to go to sleep, while I started to pack for the trip home the next day. Our son was sleeping in a little room on the main floor to the left of the front door, and the small window in his room was cracked open just a bit to let in some unseasonably warm night air. I was sitting by that window, quietly gathering up his scattered things, when the whistling once again drew closer. This time, though, instead of fading as they passed by, it sounded very close and incredibly loud, as though this person was just outside my son's window now. The blinds were down, but I was absolutely sure I could make out someone standing on the front porch outside. I leapt to the front door and flung it open. I threw on the porch light, ready to tell off this prankster on our doorstep, only to see nobody was there. I grabbed my flashlight and took a few steps out past that circle of light. I began to hear the whistling again. I thought better of this and retreated back inside. I locked up the cabin tight. I closed and latched all the windows and lowered all the blinds. If someone was creeping around outside our cabin, I didn't want them looking in at us from the darkness. Deciding I now did not want to leave my sleeping son downstairs by himself, I settled down on the sofa with a book. The whistling continued around our cabin. Between each sound, I would try to convince myself it must just be a bird or an animal, only to hear it once more and be absolutely certain it was a human being. Around 1:30 a.m., my husband suddenly leapt up and started to get dressed. I asked him what he was doing. "I'm gonna go find out whoever that is and ask them why they've been doing this for hours," he said, obviously quite angry. I was horrified. My husband is a pretty big guy. I was as curious as he was, but I felt deep in my gut that it would not be safe for him to go out and confront that person. I insisted he simply keep me company for the night, and thankfully he did. I sat there vigil, listening to the intermittent whistles all around us. It was at least an hour, until I got so exhausted I dozed off on the sofa. When I woke up, it was the next morning. The sun was now peeking around the blinds, and the whistling had long since stopped. I cautiously peered outside, half expecting to see some sort of evidence of a nighttime intruder. There was nothing there. A while later, we wandered next door, coffee mugs in hand, to get our friend's take on this mystery whistler. Amazingly, they'd not heard a single thing that night, despite the fact we'd heard that sound over and over around our cabin. Clearly, that person would have had to have passed by them to go back around. We couldn't understand how they'd not heard it. I guess maybe they hadn't done it when they were going around them. At checkout, I asked the woman at the kiosk down the road about this. She gave me this real strange look and said she didn't have any idea what I was talking about. When I got home, I searched for audios of bird calls common to the area, even ones not common in the area, in hopes of finding that same whistle somewhere on there. Nothing I found was even close. We still don't know what that was that night, circling for hours and stopping just outside our cabin door. I think I was about 18 years old when I first joined the online dating community. One of my friends had convinced me to sign up since I had just gone through a terrible breakup. I was still technically in high school, but only about 2 months from graduation. As I was clicking through one of the dating sites on my phone, I came across someone who seemed decent looking enough and fairly normal based on what I could tell from his profile. It said he was the son of a local cop, whose name I'll leave out because he's well known around these parts. We'll call him Officer V. We'll call his son Ren. Ren had just moved in with his dad from Florida and was looking to meet some new people. We chatted online for a while, then decided to meet up and go for a walk. We met up at a local ice cream shop and then walked around the downtown area getting to know each other a bit. Now, right off the bat meeting him, I was not super into him. I know nerves can get the best of people though, so I decided to give him another chance. I was a member of the marching band in high school, and we always did the local parades for Memorial Day and such like that. Well, Ren and I had been texting all day talking about meeting up for a picnic or some such after I was done with those parades. When I told Ren we were just finishing up and I needed to get home and get clean before we went out, that's when things took a turn for the creepy. He insisted on picking me up from the end of the parade, and after 10 minutes of arguing, I finally convinced him that no, he would not pick me up and would in fact wait for me to change and get cleaned up first. After I was done getting changed, I gave him my address and said he could come pick me up if he'd like. Not even 3 minutes later, he was already waiting outside. When I hopped into his car, I smelled something awful, something that can only be described as rotting and dead. I'm a messy person, sure, but I've never let my car get that gross on the inside, much less letting a date see it in that state. There were food wrappers everywhere, dirty laundry. It looked as though this guy had been living out of this car. When I asked him what we would be doing for the evening, he said we were going out to dinner, but he wanted to show me something first. You see, we lived near the third largest national military cemetery in the US, and that's where this guy took me. I would have understood, being as it was Memorial Day, wanting to make a quick stop and pay respects to those who had served, but there was no paying respect being done here. We drove through the cemetery, and he pointed out every single grave he was even remotely related to. To make matters worse, we drove through 4 cemeteries. 4 of them. When we left the last one, I thought we could finally get on with the day. Boy, was I wrong. We went back to his house, and I asked if we were still going to dinner. Well, yeah, but we have to wait for my dad, Officer V. He's taking us there. I was a good kid and never got into too much trouble, but the thought of being stuck in a restaurant with a cop watching me was more than a little unnerving. Why hadn't the guy told me this in the first place? As we were sitting on the couch watching TV, waiting for Officer V to come home, R decided it was a good time to try to make a move on me. He leaned in to kiss me and attempted to say something cute before doing so. I immediately turned my face away because of the awful stench emitting from this guy's mouth. I've dated smokers before and cigarette breath didn't really bother me, but this scent was indescribable. It was like cigarette breath on steroids. That's the only way I can say this. Thankfully, moments later, his father walked in and announced he was ready to go. After a few brief questions about my age and making sure it was okay for him to take me across state lines, we left for dinner. The entire meal, R didn't say a single word. Instead, his father basically interrogated me. Thankfully, that dinner was short. After the meal, I texted one of my friends to tell her I needed a way out of this situation. I told her to call me and pretend to be upset. As it turned out, Officer V was dating her mother, unbeknownst to me. So Ren already knew who she was, quite well in fact. I told Ren I needed to go because my friend was really upset and needed my help. Well, he downright refused to take me back to my car so I could go home, even though the only way to get to her house was to drive directly past mine where my car was parked. After that, an argument ensued about him not taking me home. He dropped me off at her house instead, and I immediately jumped out of the car without saying goodbye or thank you. At this point, I was sure Ren must have gotten the hint I was most certainly not interested. I thought I would be in the clear. His tours of the cemeteries and refusal to take me back to my car so I could go home were huge red flags. I knew this was not someone I wanted to be dating, let alone have him in my life. I blocked him on the site and deleted his number as well. The following weeks got progressively creepier though. He would somehow call and text my number all the time, even though he knew I would not answer. He would come to the baseball games I worked at and just stand there watching me. A few times I even had to have the coach throw him out because he was bothering the team. He called me once and I had my friend screen the call and blatantly tell him I was not interested and to stop doing this. He still didn't get the hint. The calls and texts continued for weeks and weeks, and I would even notice him driving by my house at all times of the day sometimes. I only ever ran into him in person once after that, at a local bar and pizza shop. I was at the bar with some friends when I noticed him walk in. As he came up behind me to talk to me, I turned my head and clearly ignored him and acted like I had neither seen or heard him. He stood there for a few minutes in silence behind me, waiting. Then he just walked away, and I've not seen or heard from him since. My friend often tells me how creepy he still is, as her mother and Officer V are now married. Word is, Ren recently got married as well. I feel so bad for that poor girl. I just hope he isn't such a creep to her like he was to me. So this was a really weird experience that happened to me. I went out rock hounding solo today to a place my husband and I have gone to many times before. Everything seemed fairly normal when I arrived. It's a fairly secluded area of the creek, with a rock bar in the middle and a small patch of woods to the left. There's a far denser forest off to the right. I crossed the creek and set up my gear on the rock bar. I grabbed a bag and started walking up along the creek. About 45 minutes into this, I kept on glancing up at the forest. I didn't know why at first, but I just kept on getting this eerie feeling. Every now and again, I'd hear a couple of thumps somewhere out there in the woods. But, it's nature. I tried not to think too much of it. After about 15 minutes more, though, I suddenly heard a very quiet meow. I was so focused on pulling up clay that I instantly stood up. I was extremely confused. I couldn't have just heard a house cat meowing out here, could I? 10 minutes went by. I was now walking further up the creek, and where would I be if I didn't hear it again? I stopped instantly. I'd for sure just heard a cat's meow. How strange. But something seemed really off about it. I started to feel real uneasy now. I turned around and headed back to my site. Something about the sound I'd heard wasn't quite right. It was like a matter-of-fact meow, if that makes sense. I don't know how else to explain it. About 5 minutes into the trek, I could hear that meowing sound behind me now. I was sweating like crazy because of the heat, but that instantly made me feel cold and clammy. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I knew what I was supposed to be hearing, a single meow, but it wasn't coming from a cat. The sound was now closer, and I could tell it sounded like someone imitating a cat's meow. I kept focused on getting back to my sight. 5 minutes later, another meow from behind me. This is where I realized that things were getting really concerning now. And that sound was coming from the same distance behind me, no matter how far I kept walking or how fast. Finally, I reached my sight once more. I pulled out my drinks and took a moment to rehydrate. That's when another cat's meow sounded right next to me. This time, I knew with everything in me, this was not a cat following me. I calmly gathered up my gear and began the trek across the creek to the path to my car. This time, right from behind my ear, a meow came. I sprinted across the creek and hunched down in a pit. I'd parked my car right next to the edge of the forest, and I was really starting to lose my shit now. I grabbed my keys and mace out and put my gear on me so I could dive into my car and rearrange later. That's exactly what I did. I dove right in. I nearly shit myself, having to take the opportunity to find the courage and sprint out to my car, but I did so, and I hightailed it out of there as fast as possible. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. The rational answer is that someone was just screwing at me, but why would they be so far out into the woods? It was like 200 acres of forest. I just don't know. I live in a small town with my family. I was 19 when this happened. My brother was 13 years old. This happened when he was on spring break from school. My parents had already gone to work, and I had a job too, but I didn't have to go in until later in the day. There was going to be a period of about 4 hours or so after I went to work that my brother would be home alone in the house. That wasn't too big a deal to us though. He was already 13 years old. On this day, I had about an hour before it was time for me to leave for work. It was around 11 a.m., I believe. When I woke up, it was raining and storming very hard. It was pretty fierce out there. The wind was strong and blowing the trees back and forth. The sky was completely black with clouds. It looked more like the sun had recently set, rather than recently having risen. The rain was pounding our house too. I was the type who didn't like to get up really long before going to work. I had to be there at 12:30, so I woke up at 11, made myself some coffee, and went into the living room to relax for a while. I was watching a bit of TV, and halfway watching the storm as well, when something outside caught my eye. I looked over, only to see a man out in the middle of the storm, walking down the street. He was tall and dressed in all black, but the weirdest thing was, he didn't seem to have an umbrella or even a raincoat. It was quite strange. I figured maybe he had just been out and about and gotten caught in the storm, but he didn't seem to be in any hurry either. As he walked down the street, he watched our house with a strange look on his face. Then he turned the block. I got a feeling something was wrong here, but I tried not to let it bother me too much. As I was watching the television more, about 10 minutes later, it caught my eye once again. I looked out the window and was quite surprised to see the man wandering around the block once more. Just like the last time, he kept glancing at our house, pivoting his head as he walked along. This time, I was much more concerned than I had been before. Before, the man was just a strange weirdo walking around in the rain. Now he was a strange weirdo walking around in the rain who seemed to have something on his mind, and it seemed to have something to do with my home. At first, I could have dismissed this all as him just having been caught out in the storm, but walking around the block multiple times indicated he was in no hurry to get anywhere. Just a strange man walking in the rain. I had finished my coffee and I had to get to work soon, but I decided I needed to wait and see if the man would circle our house yet again. I was really hoping it wasn't something other than just a weirdo who liked the rain, Maybe he really wasn't singling out our home. Perhaps he was casing every house on the block for an empty one. This was the third time he walked around, once again looking at our home specifically. I got really concerned now. It was exactly like before, too. I really wasn't sure what to do in this instance. I didn't think the guy had done anything wrong or illegal, so I couldn't call the police on him, but I didn't feel safe leaving my 13-year-old brother home alone. It was a slim chance, but there was a chance this man was going to try to break in when I left or something. I couldn't take my brother to work with me, so I had to find some other way. When I left, all the cars would be gone from the driveway. That may be exactly what this guy was looking for. After going over it in my head again and again, I decided I was being paranoid enough that I should see if I could drop my brother off at a friend's house. I explained to him that I was worried because something weird was going on here. I asked him if he had anybody who would let him stay until my parents got off work. Thankfully, he did. He called up his friend Dylan, and I dropped him off over there and headed to work myself. I double-checked and made sure everything was locked up tight before I left, too. I was working, and the rain was still coming down violently for hours. We were not very busy because of it. Around 6 p.m., though, I got a call from my mother. Someone truly had broken into our house. I wasn't really surprised, although I did feel like an idiot for not having called the police before. What bothered me the most, though, was not that the house had indeed been broken into. What bothered me is that they didn't steal a single thing, or even touch anything. That told me that the man who broke in wasn't trying to steal our things. When I explained what happened to my parents, they were very happy I hadn't left my little brother in the house alone, because who knows what would have happened to him. A few years back, my husband and I were living in an apartment in Brooklyn. One night, we decided to check our neighborhood's offender registry and discovered an offender lived in our building. It wasn't really a big deal to us, as we didn't have any children at the time, but I should mention that this guy was one creepy-looking dude. I'm talking about those wild hair, crazy eyes kind of creeper. You know, the real scary kind. We would often see the guy walking around the building or the neighborhood every now and then. He even set up a fruit stand for a while and would wildly yell at people as they passed by. He never really bothered us though, so we mostly didn't give him a second thought. At the time, I was working a pretty crazy job where I would be at work really late every night and have to take a taxi home at the end. On those nights, my husband would stay up late and wait for me to arrive home. I was a bit brain dead when I would get home after a 20-hour shift, so sometimes it would take me a while to find my keys, and my husband would have to let me in. One night, I had texted I was leaving the office around 3 a.m. About half an hour later, my husband could hear our door handle jiggling. Assuming it was me, he got up to go let me in. Something, however, made him look out the peephole first. There he saw him, the offender, completely naked, standing on the other side of the door. As soon as he sensed my husband looking out, the man stopped jiggling the handle. He looked up and put his eyeball right up to the peephole, trying to gaze in, as if he could tell my husband was looking at him right now. For some reason I don't really understand, my husband opened the door. As soon as he did this, the guy tried to force himself into the apartment. Eventually he beat the man back and got the door closed. Then he called me. I was about a mile away from our building when I got that call, and I was terrified. It must have been quite obvious, because as we arrived to the building, the taxi driver asked if he should walk me to the front door. I told him yes, I would very much appreciate that. He stood with me until my husband came outside to walk me in. We lived on the 6th floor, and from the moment we went in, you could hear someone running up and down the staircase. We ran to the elevator and jumped in, pressing the door close button over and over until it started to move. When we got to about the 3rd floor, the floor where the offender was at the time, he began to bang on the elevator doors trying to get in. We heard him run to the staircase and start running up the stairs to catch us. When we got to our apartment, I called the cops to report this terrifying situation. It took them 2 hours just to arrive, and by that time the guy had already picked up his clothes and gone home. The cops didn't even come inside the building. They made us go outside and didn't even get out of their car. When I explained what happened, they simply responded by saying, "You live in Brooklyn, get used to it." Eventually, we moved out of that building, but whenever we go back to that neighborhood, we still see that guy at his fruit stand, yelling at people as they walk by. I was 14 when this occurred, and I'm 22 now. I still remember it in crisp detail though, and it freaks me out to this day, thinking what might have happened if things had turned out just a bit differently. School was out for the summer, and I had convinced my mom to send me to Russia for a couple of months to visit my grandparents. We'd moved to North America when I was little, and I hadn't ever been back much since. Plus, I thought it would be fun being on my first trip abroad all by myself. She agreed, and off I went on my first solo transatlantic journey. My grandparents are very great people, and have always spoiled my mother and I rotten. They were ecstatic their only granddaughter wanted to visit them, so they planned a fun vacation of their own with me for a month after I arrived, to a popular beach resort city in Turkey. We were to stay at a 5-star resort in Ankara for 2 weeks. I thought that was spectacular, getting to travel to not just one but 2 countries in a single summer, and to a fancy exotic place like Turkey at that. I was dying to go. Full disclosure though, when I arrived to Russia, it was not really what I had been expecting. My grandparents are really protective people, so I couldn't do much or go anywhere by myself. That meant it got boring pretty fast, and I spent most of my days just playing PSP in my room. I was very accustomed to being active, you see, and I wanted to do lots of things like go jogging, which I'd done every day at home. I gave my grandparents a bit of a hard time about that, since they wouldn't let me go alone, and naturally they couldn't keep up with me due to their age. After about a month of this, the time came to go to Turkey together. I was super excited to finally get some freedom and a change of scenery. I had been pent up at home for far too long. The resort they had picked was sprawled out over a fairly large area. However, it was all very well secured and isolated from the rest of the city. There was also a huge garden on the property as well, which was very well suited for jogging. This time, I also had my own room separate from my grandparents too, so I took the opportunity to go off by myself and explore the grounds a bit. Most of the time, I would jog in the mornings when it was a bit cooler. I would go with my big old iPod, so I couldn't hear anything that was going on around me. I figured it was really safe since it was a really nice hotel with lots of tourists around as well. Then, I started to notice him, a pretty innocuous-seeming gardener in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing this dark green uniform. I remember he kind of reminded me of like a shriveled old date from too many years in the sun. He would always wave or say something in broken English as I passed by, while he trimmed the shrubs or mowed the lawn. I would politely wave back, smile, and nod, but didn't really pay him much attention. Fast forward through about 10 days of this, and now I was really enjoying myself. It was fun to swim in the pool and the sea, the food was really great. And my grandparents had eased up a lot so I could do a lot more by myself. They didn't know about my morning runs in the gardens though, and I was not going to tell them because I was sure they would not approve. One morning around 7 a.m. while I'm jogging, I see that gardener again. This time though, it's clear he's trying to get my attention specifically. He waves at me and yells something, so I stop and pull out my earphones, trying to figure out what he wants. Now, I know he works for the hotel, so I didn't really suspect anything. He waved at me again and motioned for me to come a bit closer. I was very confused, but I figured he wanted to tell me something, so I politely approached him. He was standing at the edge of a trail that went deeper into the gardens and off into the foliage. He was smiling and gesturing, and I could see he was holding something in his hand. I noticed he was holding a rose and extending it to me. At this point, I was confused and a little bit freaked out about what the hell I was thinking. I stayed put. Usually, the hotel staff there were chatty but nice enough. My grandparents would always get pulled into various conversations with them about things. I figured this was something of the same like. I didn't want to be rude, but I still wanted to be on my way without offending this old man. He handed me the flower and I took it, thinking maybe he wanted to show me some roses that were in bloom or something. He kept waving and gesturing like he wanted me to follow him, and stupidly I walked a bit closer. He had another flower in his hand and backed away more. Then, suddenly he stopped and started to lower it a little. That's when I noticed he was holding his other hand behind his back, and he was clearly holding something. I looked up ahead to the trail to see this little hidden-away cabin type thing where I assumed they kept their gardening supplies. Something clicked in my head then, and I began to slowly back away. The man saw me do that and tried to smile, then moved the hand he'd been holding behind his back while lunging toward me. I saw he was clearly holding some kind of rag. Without hesitation, I dropped the rose he had handed me, turned around, and sprinted at full speed. I didn't even stop to look back. I just ran like mad back to the hotel. It was not until the doors closed behind me, and I was among other people, that I looked back to see if the man had followed me. I couldn't see him anymore, though. My heart was beating like crazy. I went back to my hotel room and waited for my grandparents to wake up. I never told them about any of what happened that day and spent the rest of my vacation glued to their side. I thought if I'd said anything, they would get even more paranoid about my safety and blame me for wandering off on my own. Also, I really loved them and I kinda didn't want to ruin the remaining days for them. I saw the gardener once more on the beach. I remember seeing him talking to a security guard. I grew very uncomfortable and sunk into my sun chair as I saw him. He looked over to me and smiled. I scowled at him as he mouthed the word Rosa tauntingly and smiled again. I still remember the anger bubbling in my stomach and how much I wanted to cleave his face in. I just froze there and stared though. He walked away, and I went back to pretending nothing ever happened. Needless to say, I never went on any more morning jogs, and neither did I want to until long after that summer had ended, and I returned back home. When I was around 12 years old, my father bought me a pup tent so I could have sleepovers in the backyard with my best friend Jimmy. Once it got warm enough outside, Jimmy and I would spend many a night out in the backyard. April of that year on a Friday, I asked Jimmy if he would want to come over and have a camp out once more. He happily agreed, of course. About a half hour after he arrived at my house, though, these dark clouds began to roll in. My mom tried to cancel our camp out, but after I begged and pleaded with my father, he managed to convince my mom that Jimmy and I would be completely fine. After all, we were just going to be hanging out in the backyard by ourselves. It's not like we were actually going out into the woods or something. I was really excited myself. The storm was just going to make the night that much more enjoyable. Jimmy and I would tell a bunch of scary stories, and it would give a really good freaky ambiance with the storm outside. We watched a bit of television as a bolt of lightning momentarily lit up the sky. It still hadn't begun raining when we went out to the tent, though. If you've never been in a tent when it's storming, you're missing out on a very surreal experience. Even before the rain began to fall, the wind was hitting the tent hard. We could hear it howling all around us. Each crackle of lightning not only lit up the entire sky, but also easily shone through the thin fabric wall of the tent. Well, when the rain finally did begin pouring down, I guess I suddenly understood why my mom didn't want us spending the night out there. That poor little tent got battered by the rain slapping against it. Jimmy and I spent our night doing our best to try and scare each other. We had a flashlight, and the person telling the scary story had to hold it under his chin, to make it seem like it was more scary than it really was. Or at least, more scary than we would admit it really was. There are many reasons I remember that camp out in the storm so well. One of them is that this was the very first time I was introduced to some of those classic all-time urban legends. Jimmy told them all. The Hook Man, the one with the headlights and the killer in the back seat, and many, many others. I would say by the time it was fully raining, we had succeeded in scaring the crap out of each other. My dad came out to check on us to make absolutely sure we were okay before he went to bed. Mom was still trying to convince him to make us get back in the house and sleep in my bedroom. My dad understood that we were just having a good time, though. After he knew we were fine and we promised we wouldn't stay up too late, my dad wished us a good night and went back inside the house. About 20 minutes after that, the lights all went off as well, and Jimmy and I had the chance to really scare each other. I wasn't really aware of how much time was passing by as we kept talking and sharing stories back and forth, but it had been quite a while now since everyone else had gone to bed. We were staying up way later than we should have been. All of a sudden, there was a really bright flash of light and a crack of thunder that shook the ground. It wasn't really the thunder that worried me, though. During that very brief bolt of lightning, I'd seen a shadow in our backyard. Since the light was so brief, I hadn't really had much time to make it out through the wall of the tent, but it looked to me like there was a person on the far side of the yard, crouched down against the inside of our wooden fence. Jimmy noticed something was wrong right away, and he asked me what was bothering me. I didn't know what to tell him, though. I thought if I told him I'd seen someone skulking in the backyard, he would begin to panic. Maybe the guy would come at us, realizing we'd noticed he was there or something. I just whispered to him that we may have to go into the house as soon as possible. Before Jimmy even had the opportunity to respond to what I'd told him, though, another brief crack of lightning illuminated the area. I saw the silhouette once more. This time it was standing up and looking toward us. I told Jimmy someone was in the backyard. He didn't believe me, though. I grabbed his hand and told him we had to book it for the house. He still thought I was just trying to get back at him for all those urban legends he'd told me. The next crack of lightning, though, revealed that the man was now right outside our tent. This time, Jimmy couldn't help but see him, and he began to scream. The shadow was now at the door of the tent and began trying to pull the zipper open by force. Jimmy and I began to yell and scream for my father, even though it was very unlikely he would hear us during this storm. What happened next happened so quickly, but I was very glad that it did. The back porch light suddenly turned on. I heard what I first thought was a crack of thunder, but instead it turned out to be my father's gun. The person by the tent made a run for it, but my dad yelled at him that he had no problem putting a bullet in his back if he did. The man stopped in place. The police came and arrested the man. Turns out that the very first crack of lightning that had revealed the man to me at first had also happened to wake my father up. He'd gotten worried about us because the lightning was so strong. He went to check on us, and when he did look out the window, the second crack of lightning then revealed the man to my dad, standing in the backyard. He woke my mom up and told her to call the cops. Then he grabbed his gun out of the safe. Jimmy and I spent the rest of the night in the room, and this time we did it without any arguing. It was quite a while before either of us was comfortable sleeping in a tent again. At the time this happened, I lived in Missouri. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I was sound asleep in my bed one night. It had to be at least after midnight at this point. Very suddenly, I was awoken out of my sleep, only to see a strange man standing over me with his hands wrapped around my wrists. The moonlight slightly illuminated my room, and I could make out the man's face sort of. Mostly his thick mustache. I was overcome with fear in that moment and began to scream my head off. The man rushed out of my room immediately, and not even a few moments later, my parents rushed in to see what was wrong. I was crying my eyes out and told them what had just happened. My dad thoroughly searched the house, but nothing was found that night. My parents did their best to calm me down, and my mother slept by my side until I fell asleep. Later that very same night, even further into the evening, that same thing happened again. This time though, he was a lot gentler with grabbing my wrists. I imagine he thought if he was a little more gentle, he would be able to kidnap me while I was asleep. I'll never forget the shriek I made in that moment. You can't even begin to imagine the fear. That person was somehow in my home once again and trying to take me away forever. Once again, he ran away. My parents let me sleep in their bed for the rest of the night. When I finally became a teenager, my mom and I were talking about that incident. She told me that apparently while I was outside playing with my dad earlier that day, she was bathing my 6-month-old brother when she'd noticed someone walk past the bathroom quietly as possible. At that point, alarm bells were going off in her head, of course. She then began to hear these strange noises coming from the bedroom. She wrapped my brother up in a towel and carried him in her arms. She went outside as fast as she could. She thought the man was trying to bait her to come inside alone. My father went into the house instead and checked everywhere, but there was no one to be found. My parents' theory is that they were somehow able to get in from the back door, which led to the unfinished basement. What creeps me out, though, is that he was so quiet. Everything in the home remained untouched when he intruded. I always think about what would have happened if I just slept through all of that. I could have easily been kidnapped, or even worse, killed. My parents wanted to get out of this house as soon as possible. Of course we didn't feel safe. They sold it ASAP and moved us into a 2-bedroom apartment while our new house was being built elsewhere. I was very sad to move, of course, and I missed my friends a whole lot, but my safety was more important than anything else. I was 18 years old when this happened, in my senior year of high school. I just started dating a girl who lived an hour away in Bogalusa, Louisiana. I would frequently drive out to go see her on the weekends. If you don't know, Bogalusa sits along a river and is surrounded by many swamps. In my opinion, it's an area notorious for heavy fogs and big flooding. It's also quite rural, and it wasn't uncommon for someone to hit a deer or something when traveling to and fro. Being a young driver, my parents would ask I be home no later than 11 p.m. to avoid these accidents. On this particular day, it had rained quite heavily throughout, and at night it would be a particularly foggy trip back home. The first half of the trip was fairly normal. I drove at the posted speeds and occasionally slowed down when I saw eyes in the tree line. This contributed to the eerie air surrounding these drives. It always felt like there was something lurking about, and I was tempted to gun it out of there. The only way I can describe the feeling accurately is to say there was a certain atmosphere of stillness. Lights barely penetrated the fog, it was so thick. The rain had stopped now, and the road was all but abandoned. It was like life had stopped altogether. Time passed, and halfway through the drive, I finally reached a small bit of civilization. A Dollar General store with its lights still on, a railroad track weaving through the road, and just ahead of me a car pulled out of a McDonald's drive-thru. The car went pretty slow, which ticked me off because I had to meet a curfew. I stayed behind it though, in hopes it would just pull off soon. Following down the road, the car and myself left that small town. The path ahead was pitch dark, so I kept following at a good distance and tracked the car's taillights. I was completely exhausted. The car was going so slow it had pushed me past the curfew, and tomorrow I was going to have school anyway. I let my mind wander a bit as I rolled the windows down to get some cold air and kept following behind the car. Minutes passed and I was beginning to get quite frustrated. We approached a railroad track that was slightly uphill, and being in a hurry, I pulled in close behind the car I had followed. Out of nowhere though, the car in front of me jerked and skidded across the pavement. No more than 8 feet in front of me, I could now see an emaciated figure curled up on the tracks. Pale white, with patchy bald hair, a man rocked back and forth, tearing at his face with his fingers. I quickly threw the steering wheel to avoid him and swung my car around him. Maneuvering as best I could, I managed to dodge the man and slammed on the brakes once I had passed by. The car I was following sped along and out of sight, and now I was alone in the surrounding fog. My heart was racing. I clicked on my hazards and unbuckled my seatbelt. Jutting myself out the window, I stared back at what little the flashing lights could illuminate. Silence. Nothing except the ticking of my blinkers. "Hello?" I gently called out. "Are you all right? I didn't hit you, did I?" In the distance, the man slowly postured himself upright, and his head snapped over to me. He stood there silently, unmoving. Suddenly, he let out the most inhuman scream I'd ever heard. He broke into a full sprint and started running toward my vehicle. I quickly threw the car into drive and sped away from that scene. Not more than a minute later, I found the person I had been following earlier, who had decided to pull over and park on the road and call someone. I approached behind them and yelled out the window, "Did you see that?" "Yeah, I'm going back," the driver responded to me. He'd called the police in the meantime. We eventually went back to where the man had been, but there was nothing there, just an old railroad. To this day, it's still one of the most weird and scary things that's ever happened to me. So this story didn't happen to me. It actually happened to my very good friend who we'll call Dan. Dan is a 5'10" man from Maryland. He had a very strange sense of humor and was a very smart but all-around good guy. Anyway, we went to the same university. I'm gonna tell this story as best as I can remember, so please bear with me. Dan moved into his dorm room before his roommate did our freshman year. Dan had everything all moved in and had settled in completely. Just as he sat down, his roommate showed up to move everything in. His roommate, we'll call him Brian, introduced himself and his mother and father, who were helping him move. He seemed just like any other person. Dan decided to help his new roommate move everything in, since he didn't know anyone yet and was from a different state. Dan and Brian's family get down to their car, as Brian stayed behind in the room to put things away. This is the first red flag in this story. As they were opening the trunk, Brian's father looked at Dan directly in the face and whispered, "Good luck." Dan thought he meant with classes. He said thanks and grabbed a box, but boy was he wrong. Dan carried that box upstairs and into the room, where Brian proceeded to flip out. He screamed about how that box had his special ingredients for a project he was doing, and Dan had probably broken it. Weird, but everyone has their quirks. They finished moving Brian in, and his parents said goodbye. And again, Brian's dad told Dan good luck. It was really weird. Anyway, a couple of guys came by the door to ask if they wanted to go eat. Dan said sure, but Brian stayed behind to finish unpacking his things. While Dan was out, he got a call from Brian, asking if he would mind if he smoked weed in the room. Dan, being that he wanted to work for the CDC, said absolutely not. Brian screamed something unintelligible and hung up the phone. He called back a few minutes later and asked if he could smoke weed in the closet at least. Again, Dan said no. Brian hung up without a word, and Dan and his friends decided to go make sure he wasn't actually smoking in the room. When they arrived, they found him hiding in the closet like a goblin eating the weed. Weird as hell, right? Not even close to as bad as this will get, though. As time continued on, at night, Brian would wake Dan up by standing beside his bed, standing over him, then asking him a single question. Dan would answer, and Brian would walk back to his bed and fall asleep. This happened every night for a week. At this point, Brian had moved in an entire toolbox full of wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, nails, screws, an assortment of power tools as well. These weren't the kinds of things you'd need with you in a college dorm room. During this entire week, Brian also never left the room. The only time he would move was to eat and go to the bathroom. About 4 days before the week where dorm room changes could be made, Brian woke Dan up in the middle of the night and asked him how he felt about gay people. Dan said he didn't really care what anyone did, and it was fine with him. When Dan woke up the next morning, Brian was sitting in a chair directly by his head, staring at his sleeping face. Of course, he instinctively yelled out, "What the fuck are you doing?" Brian replied, "I think I'm starting to have feelings for you. You need to move out. I don't want you getting hurt during what's coming." After that, Dan left and didn't sleep in his room for a couple of days until he could move. Unfortunately, though, there were no open rooms, so he couldn't. During this time, Brian started to follow Dan around. He would sleep in the closet with his tools, making something. Dan eventually convinced the head of the dorm to let him move into the now empty room next door, after 3 weeks in what he described as pure hell. Dan moved to the room next door, so no big deal, right? Wrong. 2 days later, Dan got a knock at the door at 9 a.m. Thinking it was Brian coming to fuck with him, he screamed out, "What the fuck do you want?" He answered the door in his boxers. At the door, though, there were 4 state police troopers in full hazmat gear. The man in front said, "Not who you were expecting, huh?" At least someone there had a sense of humor. They let Dan put some clothes on, then led him out the door. At the end of the hallway was Brian in handcuffs. Turns out Brian had been building pipe bombs and other sorts of explosives in the dorm room while Dan was away at class. After Dan had moved out, he took over the other bed and the closet for his bomb-making activities. The reason the hazmat team was there was because Brian had spilled liquid mercury all over the floor, and they were afraid it had seeped into the other rooms. When they went through all of Brian's things, they found a plan that also had guns hidden around the city. This kid had planned a massive attack. On a special note, though, he had written Dan's name down with a heart drawn around it, and wrote specifically, "Do not kill." Brian is obviously in prison now. So I've been waiting a long time to tell the full story of the Whistler. This story requires many details, but is unexplainable, creepy, and 100% true. When I was about 8 years old, I was taking my dog for a walk through the neighborhood with my mother. It was maybe 11 p.m. or so. We lived right next to a swampy woods area on the edge of our neighborhood in Lansing, Michigan. I remember it was very silent and slightly windy as well. From somewhere down out in the swamp, we could hear someone whistling at us. It sounded sort of like a bird at first, but each whistle was different enough, with a lack of consistency made it sound human-like. I can't really even begin to describe it. My mom had this concerned, terrified look on her face. She grabbed my hand and said we should go back inside quickly. I didn't understand because I was too young, but seeing my mom freak out made me freak out too. After a while, though, I just kinda forgot about it. 2 years later, I was taking my dog out again, this time late at night. There was a large bush that could easily obscure a person behind it, right next to our front door. As I was finishing up our night walk, that whistling noise started again. Same pitches, same inconsistent human-like tones. As soon as I heard it, a chill went down my spine. I remembered that exact feeling of seeing my mom terrified, looking out into the swamp at something I couldn't see. I ran inside as fast as possible. The years continued to go by, and I thought about it less and less over time. I only told a handful of people, and it slipped my mind altogether. I mean, it happens so infrequently. Fast forward to last summer. I was now 24 and started dating my girl Sarah. We moved out to South Dakota for work. For Independence Day, we decided to go to Pierre, South Dakota, and watch the fireworks along the bank of the Missouri River. There was a free camping spot just behind a hospital where you could pitch up your tent, hang out, and see the fireworks together up the river. We were near the end of the campground, and there were very few people around us. As it was getting dark, the fireworks began to pop off. They were pretty far away, so the illumination they brought us was very little. We actually had to sit right at the edge of the river to be able to see them. A giant thunderhead was moving in, and it seemed a storm was imminent. The air seemed almost electric, and the wind was now picking up. The atmosphere was quite eerie, to say the least. The police had herded all the other boats off of the river, and had left our area to do that elsewhere as well. Most of the other campers were walking along the riverbank to get a better view of the fireworks. Sarah and I just kinda stayed back, drinking PBR tall boys and kicking it. Suddenly, we began to hear the sound of a paddle methodically dipping into the water. We saw a figure steering a canoe about 20 meters offshore. Sarah decided to go get some more beers from the car, leaving me all alone to stare at this mystery person. All of a sudden, they started to whistle at me. My entire body was frozen, covered in goosebumps. It was that exact same whistling sound from my childhood, now more than a decade later. I looked over to that figure. It was much too dark to discern who it could be. They seemed to be wearing a big hat. When perpendicular to the shore from me, they stopped paddling altogether. They turned the canoe to face directly at me and began to whistle at me once more. I was so frightened I jumped up and shouted at them, "Who are you?" They didn't say anything, just whistled a couple of more lines, then turned the canoe 180 degrees and paddled all the way out of sight. I'm a videographer, so I already had my camera by my side and was taking video of the fireworks at that moment. As the canoe was almost out of sight, I grabbed my camera and got a shot of them whistling as they paddled away. When Sarah came back from getting beers, she was very confused as to why I was so freaked out now. When I explained, she freaked out a bit too. I was convinced we would both be murdered or something that night. How would this whistling person manage to follow me after 14 years all the way to South Dakota? Was it just a coincidence? Why were they whistling the exact same tune then? Who was that person, and where were they going? So many questions were left unanswered. To this day, I'm more afraid of being outside in the dark, where I might hear that whistling once again. I'm open to any explanations. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.